Good evening and welcome. First, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples, and I'm grateful for these people who have cared for these lands for countless generations. University of Victoria offers the first degree in the world on Indigenous law. We've much to gain by the insights of these First Peoples. They consider our decision-making affects all our relations, including not just the human beings, but the plants and animals, the mountains and rivers, and the people. I dedicate this series to the memory of Abdu'l-Baha, the son of the Prophet Baha'u'llah, founder of the Baha'i faith. The reason I'm doing that is that 100 years ago in 1921, he died, Abdu'l-Baha died, but during World War I, he was actively engaged with the Central Organization for a Durable Peace in The Hague. He was in Palestine, and his letters and their replies had to be hand-delivered. These organizations, among others, had hundreds of thousands of members around the world, and they were instrumental in founding the League of Nations. I'm talking about the UN we love. Sometimes I forget that not everyone knows a lot about the United Nations and what an amazing organization it is. It's 75 years old last November and has accomplished such an extraordinary number of changes in the world. But because it's not in the news, it's not violent, we really don't know very much about it. So I want to just share with you some of the aspects of the UN that I love. I want to tell you that I spoke to a peace conference of about 300 people. This would be in, I guess, around 2007. As they came into the room, I asked them if they thought that human beings would ever get rid of war. I wanted them to stand on that side of the auditorium. And if they thought that human beings would never be able to get rid of war, to move to the other side of the auditorium. So everyone moved, and I looked over, and this group, the group who think we will get rid of war, was about 15 people. So on this side, there were about 285. And that same division happened again and again in the different meetings where I was speaking. My book had just been published, and so I was doing a lot of speaking. So there's two lessons to be learned from this. One is that the vast majority of people believe that they have this worldview that says that human beings are inherently violent, and that come what may, eventually we will go to war again, that our culture is based on dominance by force. The other group has a different worldview. And the second interesting point to me is that this was a peace conference, and yet the vast majority of the audience didn't believe that we would ever get rid of war. Excuse me. So we now know that that worldview is incomplete, the worldview that says that we are inevitably going to go to war. We are, in fact, hardwired to be cooperative, but our attention is drawn to violence, and newspapers and media pick up on that. In fact, they even have a saying that says, if it bleeds, it leads. So put the most violent stories of all on the front page of the paper. So today I could ask you, if you think that if we are creating a new global system, a system for global governance that would be fair, just, effective, that would act for the common good, that would put the environment, human rights, and social justice above profit, I'm guessing that if I asked that and asked how many of you thought we would and how many would be skeptical, that the vast majority of people would be skeptical. The reason is we are deeply, deeply mistrustful of people in authority, of governments, of religious leaders, and of corporations. And we have good reason for that. They have over and over betrayed our trust. Leaders of huge organizations that give them power have acted often, most of the time, with unbridled self-interest. But here we are again, together, facing a world in crisis. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. We know that we are in a state of really terrible instability right now. We know we may not survive climate catastrophe. Unstable leaders may unleash nuclear weapons again. And as was said by one of them recently, with fire and fury such as the world has never seen. COVID-19 may mutate and come back to us in an even more deadly form. And our global financial system may collapse in the chaos. But here we are together because something tells us that love is stronger than hate, and that if we pull together, we'll get through this. That other worldview is now out of date. This course is based on a most amazing book called Global Governance and the Emergence of Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions in the 21st Century. And before the celebrations of the UN 75th anniversary, in the week before that, there were webinars by various non-governmental organizations, and one whole morning was devoted to this book. And the professor who was the moderator of the panel started out by holding up the book to the camera. And this is my version of the book. You know, it's a free download from Cambridge University Press, so you can download it. I downloaded it, printed it up, and had it bound in sections at the printer. So I held up this book and he said, "I love this book. I used up 3 highlighter pens reading this book." And I share that feeling. You know, it's a most amazing collection of evidence from very authoritative sources telling us that we can indeed restore, reform, or replace the United Nations with an organization that is just, equitable, effective, compassionate, and working for the common good. I want to just read one of the paragraphs from the preface. You were asked to read the preface in preparation for this course, so this is a paragraph you've already read. Failure to strengthen the international order now will increase the likelihood of societies around the world being overwhelmed by global crises with devastating worldwide consequences. The survivors may be forced to rebuild a global institutional framework after a third world war or nuclear exchange, the collapse of the global economy, a pandemic wiping out a significant part of the world's population, or extreme climate change, which is already beginning to produce mass migrations, any of which could overwhelm existing institutions. So that's why we're here studying this now. And I want to tell you that I'm very grateful for the group of friends who've studied this book with me for the past year. They are Sheila Flood, Sharon Welsh, Jonathan Down, and Michael Truman. And I want to thank Jim Flood for his technical help on all of this. So we read and we reread chapters of the book and finally decided that we had to share it with others because it's just so important and so fascinating. They will be here facilitating in breakout rooms. The book link is in your notes kit, and you'll find references for further reading as we go through the sessions. The preface that you read gives you the condensed summary of the book. I'm not going to summarize the book. What I'm doing is pulling out the essential principles that we need to discuss because they're part of the worldview that is needed in order to build this new kind of society. There's also homework in the course if you want to do it. The homework is usually not very long, but it's such things as a film that's too long to put into the session, or a passage that it would be helpful for you to read before you come. You won't lose marks if you don't do the homework, but I know that you'll find our discussions in breakout groups to be much richer if you've done that preparation. So I'll move on to the first slide. There are two forces in operation in the world today: a force of disintegration, which we've just talked about, all of the things that are collapsing, institutions collapsing, degenerating. And on the other side, forces of integration. In the force of disintegration, we have great difficulty discerning truth from lies, and hope is hard to find. The other direction is toward building an advancing civilization based on higher values, trustworthiness, honesty, and compassion, where respect for science and commitment to the common good are combined with respect for diversity, human rights, and dignity. We're going to focus on the integrative vision of the future for the next 6 weeks. In February of 2013, the US and the UK decided to start a second war in Iraq, and millions of people around the world hit the streets to protest against this new war. The protests didn't just last that weekend, they went on for months. And one French academic has estimated a total of 36 million people protested the war, 36 million around the world. The New York Times wrote, and I'm quoting, "The fracturing of the Western alliance over Iraq and the huge anti-war demonstrations around the world this weekend are reminders that there may still be two superpowers on the planet, the United States and world public opinion. World public opinion is expressed by civil society." These are the pillars of a successful society: government, the economy, and civil society is the conscience. It expresses the conscience that holds government and the economy accountable. We didn't succeed in stopping that war in Iraq, but we did show very strong public opposition to war and our determination to have a voice in the future. We'll see the growing importance of the role of women in bringing conscience to government and the economy, and the role of civil society over the next years from 2003. Most of us are oblivious to the successes of the United Nations because our media focus on violence, conflict, and tragedy. Our worldview is shaped by what we watch and listen to, and also what we learned as children when we were surrounded by this. We listen to the fact that massive profits feed media giants who have the mantra, "If it bleeds, it leads." And so violence ends up on the front page of our newspapers. So I call the talk today "The UN We Love" because it's the 75th anniversary of the founding of the UN, and we so rarely celebrate its achievements. I want to start by reading to you the preamble of the United Nations Charter. I met a man who actually carried this in his wallet, and at a conference, he pulled it out and read it to the audience. "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. And for these ends, to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, and to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, and to ensure, by the acceptance of principles and the institution of methods, that armed force shall not be used, save in the common interest, and to employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples. We have resolved to combine our efforts to accomplish these aims." The Charter is a beautiful aspirations of a world that had just emerged from war. And the next really big triumph was establishing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's Eleanor Roosevelt standing there with the big chart of the Declaration. This was in 1948. It was adopted unanimously by the 54 nations that were present at the drafting and the signing. And at the same time, the World Health Organization was founded in 1945. And you may or may not know that the enormous achievement of the World Health Organization is the eradication of smallpox. Smallpox is a horrendous disease. It has a huge mortality rate because some enormous percentage, 80 to 90%, I think, of victims actually die. It's mentioned in the Bible. It's been a curse of humanity for that long. And through the determined efforts of the World Health Organization, they set up a campaign of vaccinations. The final countries were the more impoverished countries like India. And in fact, India had the very last case of smallpox in the 1970s. And since then, you haven't even needed to have your children immunized because there is no smallpox virus available anymore. Polio, as well, is almost eradicated now. There are two pools of polio still around where they haven't been able to get to vaccinate, to immunize all of the children. This picture is a picture of a baby receiving the oral polio vaccine. Life expectancy has increased enormously. This is global life expectancy from 1960, when it was only 52 years, to now when it's 72 years. And of course, in countries as advanced as ours, it's in the 80s now rather than in the 70s. So World Health Organization, on a very small budget, has accomplished a huge amount. The next success story is the rule of law. In 1945, when the UN was founded, they also founded the International Court of Justice. It's a picture on the bottom left of the screen. The ICJ is there to be the arbiter in disputes, between countries. So they bring the case to the ICJ, and the ICJ renders its opinion. Unfortunately, it does not have enforcement capabilities. So even though they may rule in favor of one country or the other, they can't enforce that, and the countries can withdraw and ignore the ruling. So that's one of the weaknesses that has to be corrected in this new system of world governance. Then in 2002, the International Criminal Court was founded. And I can remember that I was in New York for a conference at the same time that people were talking about this. We were talking about the Non-Proliferation Treaty for Nuclear Weapons, but at the same time, we were lobbying to get an international criminal court. And here's why. Up until then, if a leader called for a genocide or crimes of war, crimes against humanity, the leader of the country was immune from prosecution. With the beginning of the International Criminal Court in 2002, now those leaders that cause a genocide and who instigate war crimes can be held accountable, and more than 65 of them now have been convicted and jailed, or they have died. The crime of aggression is a new one that was added to the statutes in 2017. The crime of aggression says that a leader who commits the first act of aggression that leads to armed violence and war, that leader is guilty of the crime of aggression and can be tried at the ICC. So an example of the kind of crime that can be prosecuted now is if a leader orders the drone assassination of someone in another country, that is a crime of aggression. And that country can press the charge, can charge them at the International Criminal Court, or any other country that is a member of the ICC can make that charge. This is a very, very big step forward, because if the leader knows that the first act of aggression will be on his personal responsibility, then that, I hope, will make a difference. Nation building. The Rand Corporation did a study, and this must have been sometime before 2006 because I wrote about it. They found that 67% of UN nation building initiatives are successful. My suspicion is that the Rand Corporation was actually planning to demonstrate that UN nation building initiatives were not successful and that probably war was more efficient. But they found indeed, and to their credit, reported that the UN is overwhelmingly successful. These are initiatives such as educational initiatives, teaching people how good governance works, how to prevent corruption, how to run elections and election observers. That kind of thing falls under the heading of nation building, but it's much broader than that. It's much more into the development area of the United Nations. In disarmament, which is my field, there have been major successes at the UN. Biological weapons, germ warfare, biological weapons were banned in 1972. Chemical weapons were banned in 1993, and landmines were banned in 1997. I'll have a lot more to say about the landmines campaign because that was a campaign of civil society and a very successful one, and a successful collaboration of the international campaign to ban landmines with the government of Canada, and in particular with our Minister of Foreign Affairs then, Lloyd Axworthy. Nuclear weapons were banned in 2017, and that treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons came into effect this year, January 21st of 2021. And I'll have a lot more to say about that because, again, that was another example of civil society, and this time really a wonderful collaboration of governments of different nations working with the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. I should point out too that chemical weapons have been used. They were used in Syria recently, and there are occasional instances where these weapons are still used. But what we can be grateful for is that the vast majority of countries that sign treaties abide by them. The UN also issues declarations and conventions, and these are really statements of the norm that is to be expected of civilized societies. The rights of the child, the Declaration of the Rights of the Child is one, and the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is another. You may remember that BC signed the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I think last year. And this has actual legal consequences in the countries that sign them. We must not be enemies is part of a quotation by Abraham Lincoln where he calls upon the better angels of our nation, of our nature. The other three things that I'd like to point out as successes of the United Nations and of the world pulling together are the huge reduction in extreme poverty, the improvement of labor standards all over the world, and this is, of course, not universal, a 40-hour work week and no child labor and such things as that, but those are the standards to which nations are expected to rise. And literacy is an enormously important one, particularly the literacy of women and girls. I'm going to stop there and show the video of Eleanor Roosevelt and the Declaration of Human Rights. The link to this will be in your teaching notes. I hope now that you'll take time to have a breakout room discussion if you're here in person. And if you're watching this as a recording, perhaps you can get together with others who've been watching it with you and discuss these questions. Do you have any comments on the video about Eleanor Roosevelt in 1948? And then here's the big question. What is needed at the global level to resolve, and you can pick one or more of these issues, to resolve health issues, global health issues such as disease and malnourishment and violence against women and so on, as well as a pandemic? What is needed at the global level to resolve the climate crisis and now the other crises of environment, such as the plastics in our oceans? And finally, what is needed at the global level to resolve peace issues and disarmament and to truly advance the prohibition of nuclear weapons? So we have 20 minutes for that discussion. Finally, I'd just like to summarize by saying that the United Nations has weaknesses that have paralyzed us. And these are some of the transformations that we need to make that we will be discussing over the next weeks. First of all, we have to go from an organization of nation states to we the peoples. Ordinary people all over the world have to have a say that is not filtered through the interests of their national leaders. Secondly, we need a General Assembly with legislative and enforcement power. At the moment, all of that power is in the Security Council, and within the Security Council, which is only 15 countries, within the Security Council, the 5 big nations, the powerful ones, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, those 5 each have veto power. And the result of that has been that every time an issue of prevention of war comes up in the Security Council, one of the big powers vetoes any kind of advancement, and the result has been 200 wars in the past 75 years. So I'd like to close by reading this really beautiful quotation from Dag Hammarskjöld. Dag Hammarskjöld was one of the very, very distinguished Secretary Generals of the United Nations. He was the second one, Danish economist, and very visionary leader. He wrote, "The principles of the Charter are by far greater than the organization in which they are embodied, and the aims which they are to safeguard are holier than the policies of any single nation or people." Thank you.